Welcome back to Inside History, the channel for those who love contemporary history. Today we're going to take a closer look at a figure who has already appeared in several of our videos, the figure of Licio Gelli, an enigmatic man, a man who has marked a large part of Republican history with his actions, his name, and even his shadow. Well, the figure of Licio Gelli has been the subject of intense historiographical attention, but especially focused on the period of the Lodge, P2, and on the events that led to the discovery of the P2 lists in 1981, and subsequently to the developments of this affair. The long earlier phase from Licio Gelli's childhood up to the early 1970s has been investigated less systematically, and this constitutes the historical, personal, political, relational, and cultural matrix of the later trajectory of the one who has been called Gelli, the old man, the mattress maker, or simply the venerable one. The underlying interpretative hypothesis is that the P2 does not represent something sudden in the life or career of Gelli. Rather, the outcome, we would say consistent, of a long accumulation of symbolic and relational capital, which began much earlier, started in the Fascist era. He was born into a family that belonged to the middle bourgeoisie, or, if you prefer, the urban middle class. Pistoia at the time, in the aftermath of the First World War, was marked by strong political and social tensions, agrarian conflicts, the Red Biennium, a strong socialist presence in the city, and clashes between the emerging fascist squads and workers' organizations. The rise of fascism fits right into this context. At the time, the Gelli family was part of a milieu that was not marginal in relation to the new dominant political culture. The young Licio grows up in an environment where fascism is not simply the regime, but something more. It is something that permeates the school with the introduction of fascist culture as a subject and as a mandatory subject, reinforced by youth organizations. The sources on his childhood are quite rich. The Direction Licio, History of Italy, he was reinforced by his story, a chapter dedicated to Licio Gelli. He himself struggles to find anything extremely clear. What is certain, however, is that Licio Gelli at a certain point was expelled from the schools of the kingdom. According to the version given in various interviews, even in the memoirs, the young Licio was expelled for having attacked, confronted, even slapped a teacher accused of anti-fascist attitudes. The classic controversy, something we've seen happen countless times. The school records, what has been possible to trace, do not always confirm this sequence of events in detail. There is no clear evidence pointing to verbal or physical violence. However, it is documented that Licio Gelli interrupts his educational path early. From a historical point of view, this transition is significant because it marks the early exit from the regular curriculum and the complete entry into the fascist world, starting with its organizations. Like many young people of his time, young Licio joins the Balilla and later the fascist university groups, the Gruppi Universitari Fascisti. Even though he had officially left the classical curriculum, he continued his studies as a private candidate. The regime's youth organizations were not just simple gymnastic or recreational structures. They were tools for indoctrination, political training, and selection. Socialization took place through collective rituals, paramilitary discipline, the rhetoric of sacrifice or the cult of the leader, fascist Saturdays, and rallies. In this environment, Gelli developed a conception of politics as permanent mobilization and radical ideological conflict. However, the turning point came in the second half of the 1930s. At the time, Licio Gelli was not yet of age when he saw his older brother Raffaello leave for the adventure in Spain. In July 1936, as we've already seen in the miniseries dedicated to the Spanish Civil War available on the channel, the Spanish Republic was shaken by the pronunciamiento, the coup promoted by the Nationalist Front and the generals. Fascist Italy rushed to the aid of the generals themselves, starting with Franco. It provided planes to transport the Moroccan army to the mainland and sent ships, theoretically to fight illegal trafficking and arms smuggling, but in reality to support the nationalists and carry out real acts of piracy, including attacks on neutral or Republican ships and nighttime bombings of cities, and a volunteer corps, 4 divisions, that are sent to fight side by side with the nationalists. In 1937, Gelli, shortly before turning 18, also volunteers for Spain, enlists and takes up arms. The conflict, after all, was not just a civil war, it was a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. On a technological level, with the testing of new weapons, on a tactical level, with the experimentation of new ways of waging war, and on an ideological level. In Italy, the Spanish Civil War is presented as a goal. Against a crusade against international Bolshevism, participation in the conflict therefore offered young Italians a rite of passage from propaganda and drills to the practical test of weapons, the trial by fire. Archival documentation confirms the presence of Licio Gelli in the Spanish theater, even though his actual activities and his role in the conflict remain a subject of discussion. What seems to be in doubt is the symbolic impact of the experience, but during the conflict, Raffaello Gelli, Licio's older brother, lost his life in combat. It's a traumatic event. It's an event that once again changes the perspective of the young Licio. The family mourning takes on a crucial value in the construction of his personality. In the cultural context of fascism, death in war was sanctified as a sort of sacrifice for the benefit of the homeland. Licio Gelli processed the loss of his brother not only by later giving the name Raffaello to one of his sons, but also by turning the legitimacy of the Italian fascist cause into an absolute confirmation. The death of Raffaello Gelli became a foundational element of a biography destined to shake Italy. After returning to his homeland, Licio Gelli published a memoir dedicated to his Spanish experience, titled Fuoco. Previously, the same writings were published in installments in a young fascist newspaper. This work fits into the tradition of war memoirs promoted by the regime, even though, upon careful reading, it contains grammatical blunders and presents reconstructed forms of extreme simplification of what the war effort really was. It also contains some made-up details, but that doesn't matter at all. In that period, the second half of the 1930s, Italian publications were overwhelmed by the need to glorify the farms. Military figures and the war efforts of the regime, which invested a great deal, many resources both in the adventure in Ethiopia and in the one in Spain. Gelli is still in the Gruppi Universitari Fascisti fascist university groups, either to further strengthen the Italian armed forces or to avoid giving gifts to other countries. Outbreak of the Second World War. Licio Gelli is still in the Gruppi Universitari Fascisti, the fascist university groups, a formative experience. This too, and it's an experience that basically sees Gelli making a career through the Gruppi Universitari Fascisti. He gets himself appointed inspector of the National Fascist Party and is first given the task of inspecting the sections, as well as overseeing the training of the young vanguardists. But in July 1942, this assignment of his turns into something different, transporting King Peter's treasure to Italy. Peter II of Yugoslavia, the boy king. We've already talked about him. You can find the video on the channel. That treasure, 60 tons of gold bars, ancient coins, millions of dollars and pounds, had been taken by the Military Intelligence Service, the SIM, the military espionage. That treasure was supposed to arrive in Italy and be managed by the armed forces. But something from that treasure disappears. 5 years later, when, according to the peace treaties, Italy has to return it because of the war. The new People's Republic of Yugoslavia, the treasure, is missing 20 tons of gold bars, a third of the gold shipment. It's gone. The theory that has long been suggested but always denied by Licio Gelli himself is that the precious material was stolen and later smuggled to South America, specifically to Argentina. However, a part of it would have remained immediately available to Licio Gelli himself, who would have it. In the 1943 of the 19th century, Licio Gelli fled in an Italian social republic that was born within a few days after Mussolini was freed from prison on Gran Sasso. Young Gelli serves as a liaison between Salo's fascist government and the Third Reich, handling various tasks, a bit of everything: ration cards, gasoline cards, ammunition, even the supply of shoes and blankets for the troops and paramilitaries. From Fiume, Gelli moves to Lombardy, then returns to Tuscany, and here something changes. Because probably realizing that the war is destined to be lost by the Nazi-fascist totalitarian regimes, Gelli decides to switch sides, and he does it with an event that is still talked about today. It was actually reported by Indro Montanelli himself, the sensational escape from the Spertoli Villas prison. According to the account given by Indro Montanelli, Gelli offered himself to the partisans as a Trojan horse to allow a small action group to enter the Spertoli Villas and help the partisans imprisoned there escape. For what reason? Because Gelli had signed passes from both the fascist authorities of the Italian Social Republic and the Germans, and because Gelli knew most of the prison guards. But why should the partisans have trusted Licio Gelli? What made them decide to trust that man? It's hard to find a clear way to interpret this. First of all, because Gelli's first contact with the partisans, Silvano Fedi from Pistoia, was killed under unclear circumstances shortly after the escape from the Spertoli Villas. Precisely in connection with Silvano Fedi's death, Gelli was suspected of the murder, and that's why, after the escape from the Spertoli Villas, Gelli became a highly wanted man. He was wanted by the Italian Social Republic for desertion, by the Gestapo because he was accused of playing a double game, and by the partisans for the death of Silvano Fedi. While in hiding, Licio Gelli started his family by marrying Vanda Vanacci, a woman from Pistoia who was 7 years younger than him. He had several children with her. The first, as mentioned, he named Raffaello, born in Pistoia on June 28, 1947, then Maria Rosa, Maria Grazia, and finally Maurizio. When the war ends, when the weapons fall silent, when the time for peace comes, Licio Gelli also benefits from the period of reconciliation. Put on trial for collaborationism, Gelli benefits from the Togliatti amnesty and essentially enjoys a complete absolution for everything concerning his wartime and even pre-war period. It's almost as if people forget about Licio Gelli the fascist, Licio Gelli the legionnaire in Spain, Licio Gelli the fascist inspector, Licio Gelli the smuggler of valuables, all forgotten. In the 1950s with his family, Gelli settles in Arezzo and starts his first business activities. He becomes a small entrepreneur in the textile sector. But that's not all. He also starts a political career, a career that goes through the role, as we would say today, of an aide, a jack-of-all-trades secretary, someone who takes care of a bit of everything, in favor of a political bigwig, specifically the Christian Democrat deputy Romolo Thien, who is elected precisely in Gelli's district, the Florence Pistoia district. For 10 years, from 48 to 58, Gelli is the jack-of-all-trades, the aide to Thien. And through Toisy, he begins to have his first opportunities to advance his career. He gives up his career in textiles, gives up the bookstore he managed for a short time, and thanks to the support of the Christian Democracy Party, to which he belongs, he gets new opportunities. Wartime, the position of commercial director at Permaflex in Frosinone, a company that had obtained funds from the Cassa del Mezzogiorno to boost the economy in an economically depressed area of Italy. While working for Permaflex in Frosinone, Gelli met other politicians, including Giulio Andreotti, who years later would remember him during the hearings at San Macuto. He downplayed their acquaintance as simple, sporadic meetings and almost forgot about the mattress order for the armed forces, for the Italian army, which had been secured for Permaflex by Gelli himself. Gelli's career was, we could say, almost anonymous at first, until something else happened. Political friendships, so-called recommendations, connections, it's unclear in what capacity, with the Counterintelligence Center in Florence, first with Servizio Informazioni Forze Armate, and then with Servizio Informazioni Difesa. Licio Gelli is an informant for the police, then for the Carabinieri, providing information that is sometimes considered valuable, sometimes negligible. But he also understands one thing, that relationships, personal and otherwise, are fundamental within any career, whether political or entrepreneurial. For this reason, in the second half of the 1960s, Licio Gelli gets closer and closer to the world of Italian Freemasonry. He wins the favor of Giordano Gamberini, who was the Grand Master at the time, and for this reason, little by little, he first convinces Gamberini and then his successor Lino Salvini to entrust him with a task, the task of reorganizing a lodge that had been reduced to a temporary parking spot, of Freemasons without a homeland, of Freemasons who no longer had a lodge of their own. It was the Propaganda Lodge. We have already talked about in the past, the one that was created as a flagship, as a place to gather the top figures, especially at the ministerial and executive level, of what was then the Kingdom of Italy, and which, with Gelli, radically changed its face. From there, a new story begins, a story we have already discussed several times, the story of the CFAR files that were supposed to be destroyed but instead ended up in Gelli's private archive, the story of dangerous friendships with spies, generals, admirals, journalists, bankers, the story of the plan for democratic rebirth, an attempt to rewrite Italy and to change it in a hidden way, a story that then naturally leads to bloodshed. Judge Vittorio Corso, before being killed by Pierluigi Concutelli, was investigating Gelli and his associate Umberto Ortolani as part of the investigations into the Marsigliese clan. Finally, a story that leads to 1981, to the discovery of the lists, to the scandal, to the resignation of the Forlani government, to the birth of the first Spadolini government, to the upheaval in finance and intelligence services, and, from that moment on, associating the letter P with a number to all possible plots, real or alleged. In conclusion, the figure of Licio Gelli had a direct influence on his own development, on his personal journey. Think about being excluded from school, the Spanish Civil War, the death of Gelli, memories, episodes that might seem marginal, but they are not. If anything, it is a trajectory that later leads Licio Gelli to adapt like some animals do, which, depending on the circumstances, are hunters or prey, but always in a sly way. His future experience in the P2 cannot be understood without first knowing who Licio Gelli was, what stories he went through, what he did. Who was he? Licio Gelli didn't suddenly emerge in 1981 as a hidden puppet master. He is a man who built a life of relationships, sometimes dangerous ones, based on his ability to adapt to situations and circumstances. The example of the Sbertoli villas is perhaps the culmination of all this. Licio Gelli was a product deeply rooted in the political culture of the fascist period in which he was born and raised, and in his personal development of a vision of politics as a means to achieve any goal, not just personal ones. The figure of Licio Gelli as the head of P2, as the old grand puppet master, as a man capable of manipulating even governments or secret service committees like puppets, was born much earlier. It is born, it settles, it grows, it develops, it adapts, thanks to a formative path that is hardly applicable. This is what is often underestimated about Gelli, his personal history. A story that began long before the turning point of the P2. And it's a story we wanted to tell you to help you better understand what is one of the great Italian mysteries.